The elderly man shuffled through the airport terminal, his cane tapping softly against the hard floors, his tired eyes scanning the crowd. But not really seeing it, he had long ago learned to block out the noise and the chaos of the world around him. His steps slow, deliberate, the weight of the years, pulling at his shoulders, but his mind sharp, still always sharp. The gate was just ahead, a long flight ahead of him, but it was nothing he hadn't done before. As he approached the counter, the attendant barely glanced up, offering him a brief smile before handing him the ticket. It was nothing personal, just routine. But something about the way she looked at him made him wonder if she knew anything at all about the man standing before her. She saw a frail old man who was just another passenger, another face in a crowd. And that was fine with him. It had been years since he had wanted anyone to see him for who he truly was. All he wanted was to sit quietly on this plane and let the world go by unnoticed. He was used to it after all. And as he made his way through the security check and into the boarding area, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. He had done his part in this world. His legacy was something no one knew about, and that suited him just fine. So he waited patiently with the others, waiting for the boarding call, for the flight that would take him somewhere far away, a place where he could just disappear again. If only for a while. The time passed slowly. He glanced around the terminal, watching the other passengers' families, talking animatedly, children running up and down the aisles, young people glued to their screens. No one seemed to notice the man sitting in the corner of the room. They didn't know who he was or what he had done. They didn't know the weight of the things he had carried with him all these years. It was a weight that no one could ever truly understand. But he didn't mind it anymore. He had learned to live with it. So when the final call for boarding came, and the other passengers began to shuffle toward the gate, he stood slowly and made his way toward the plane ahead of him. The flight attendants greeted him with the same polite indifference they gave to all passengers. He nodded quietly and made his way to his seat, sitting near the window, as he had done countless times. Before he settled into his seat, the hum of the plane's engines starting to drown out the world around him, a comforting sound that he had grown used to over the years. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles as the plane began to fill up with passengers. Some of them looked nervous, others seemed eager, but most were just busy with their own lives, oblivious to the elderly man sitting quietly in his seat, waiting for the flight to begin. He wondered if any of them had any idea what was coming for him and what was about to unfold on this very flight. He had been through so many of these before, but something about today felt different. Something about the way the plane felt beneath him felt different. It was a subtle change, but he could feel it in his bones, the kind of feeling that only comes when you've lived through enough to know when something is about to happen. The flight attendants continued their rounds, making their way past him with their smiles and their small talk, but none of them noticed him. Not truly. They didn't see the past he carried. They didn't see the man he used to be, the man who had once saved lives with nothing but his wits and his courage and his hands. But that was a lifetime ago, and it was nothing they needed to know. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories of another time fade into the background. He would be just another passenger on this flight, and that was all he needed to be. The flight attendants moved with practiced ease through the aisles, greeting passengers and offering drinks. The plane hummed steadily as it climbed higher into the sky. Outside the window, the clouds seemed to part, offering a glimpse of the vast blue nothingness below. The elderly man glanced at his reflection in the window. For a moment, his features older than he remembered, but still sharp. His eyes always had a way of seeing things that others didn't. The hum of conversation around him was a blur. He had grown accustomed to it, the chatter of people who didn't know him, and never would. It didn't matter to him. He had no need for their recognition, no need for their admiration. He was content to watch them as they went on with their lives, oblivious to the quiet man who sat among them. He adjusted his coat and leaned back in his seat as the flight attendants began to make their rounds. One of them approached his row, a young woman with bright eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach her face. She stopped in front of him, asking if he would like a drink. The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes had already drifted to the book in her hand, the cover unfamiliar. But he didn't mind. It was just another distraction, just another moment of small talk. But the woman's smile faltered. As she waited for his response, she repeated her question politely. But there was something in the way she spoke that made the man's attention shift. He looked up at her, then back at the book, and something about the interaction rubbed him the wrong way. The woman was too eager, too unaware of the world around her. She was busy serving drinks to the other passengers, her eyes darting to the young couple in the front row, the man who had been ordering whiskey since takeoff. But when it came to him, the elderly man, she seemed to forget the basic courtesy. It wasn't that he needed a drink, it wasn't that he wanted anything, but a simple gesture of acknowledgement, something more than the polite brush-off. She gave him the flight attendants. Were always like that, busy with their own lives, moving from one task to the next, forgetting that the passengers they served were people too. The man had seen it before, the same routine, the same lack of attention. But today it bothered him more than usual. He had no idea why. It was just the way things went these days. People passed him by and never thought twice. The world moved so fast. And they were all in such a hurry. But they didn't know anything about him. They didn't know his story, the things he had done, the lives he had touched, the legacy he carried quietly with him through every airport, every flight he had taken in the years. Since the war, his hand tightened around the armrest, slightly, the only indication that something had shifted inside of him. The young flight attendant gave him a look as she moved away to attend to the other passengers. She didn't notice him, not really. She saw an elderly man in a seat who probably wanted a blanket or a cup of tea, and that was the extent of her thought process. And yet there was something about her that nagged at him, something in the way she moved, in the way she seemed to ignore him. It reminded him of other times, when the world had ignored him too, when he had been overlooked, when his actions had gone unnoticed by those who didn't understand who he was or what he had done. And yet here he was again, just another forgotten face on another flight. And that was how he had chosen it, to remain all these years. He had no need for recognition, no need for applause. The world had given him its due, and now it was time to fade into the background again, to be no more than a silent figure in the cabin as the plane soared higher into the sky. As the plane leveled out, and the hum of the engines became a constant companion, the elderly man closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories drift back to him. The sounds of distant gunfire and the smell of smoke filled his senses, but he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the quiet that now surrounded him, the calm of this flight, the peace of this moment. It was hard to imagine that a lifetime ago he had been anyone else, that he had been someone who had done things no one could ever forget. But all of that felt so far away now, as if it had happened in another life, a life he had long since buried. The flight attendants moved through the aisles again, but the man paid them no mind. He wasn't interested in the beverages or the snacks they offered. He wasn't interested in the young voices that filled the air with idle chatter. He had seen it all before. The world had moved on and left him behind, but it didn't matter to him. He had learned to let go of the past years ago, when the war had ended and he had quietly disappeared into the folds of ordinary life. He had traded the spotlight for solitude, and though there were moments when the weight of his choices bore down on him, he had come to terms with it. He had saved countless lives in ways no one would ever understand, and he had never asked for a word of thanks or recognition. He had done his duty, and that was all that mattered. His gaze shifted to the passengers around him, their faces a blur of unfamiliarity. The younger couples leaning against each other, laughing at some private joke, the businessman tapping away at his phone, oblivious to the world outside. The elderly man watched them all for a while with a detached curiosity. There was a time when he had been just like them, eager to make his mark in the world, when he had been full of life and ambition. But now it all felt so distant, so unimportant. The man had long ago given up on the idea of leaving behind a legacy. He had made peace with the fact that his name would never be remembered by history. and that was just fine with him. He had no need for fame or glory anymore. His legacy was buried deep within him, wrapped in memories of days, long past moments of heroism that could never be relived and never retold. The life he had led before this flight was gone, and nothing more than a faded dream now. But as he sat there quietly in his seat, a subtle change in the air around him caught his attention. Something felt different. It was a feeling he couldn't quite place, a small shift that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes flicking to the flight attendants as they passed once more. Something about them seemed more hurried than before, more frantic, as if they were trying to outrun something unseen. The young flight attendant from earlier moved past him again, this time her face a little more tense, a little less composed. But still she didn't seem to notice him at all. It was as if he didn't exist at all to her, or to anyone else on this flight. He was just another old man sitting in the seat, minding his own business. But then there was that feeling again, that prickling sensation that something was about to change, something was coming, and the man couldn't shake the sense that it had something to do with him, something that was drawing him back into the fray, whether he wanted it or not. And for a brief moment, his fingers flexed around the armrest, once more his mind racing through the motions, the decisions, the plans, the training he had once known so well. But then it passed, the feeling fading into the background once again as the flight continued on, the passengers oblivious to the storm that was quietly building just below the surface of this seemingly ordinary journey. The sudden jolt of the plane shook him from his thoughts, his grip on the armrest tightening, as the cabin filled with a low rumble of unease. The lights flickered overhead, and the passengers shifted in their seats, uneasy murmurs spreading like wildfire through the cabin. The elderly man's eyes opened slowly, his senses alert, as the plane dipped again, this time more sharply than before. The stewardess at the front of the aisle froze, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. The calm facade that had been carefully maintained by the crew for so long was beginning to crack. The passengers looked around at each other, confused, unsure of what was happening. The elderly man's gaze never left the woman in front of him. She was already moving, trying to keep control of the situation. But there was something about the way she moved, something frantic in her steps, that made him uneasy. He had seen this kind of panic before. It was the same panic that had crept into the eyes of soldiers in battle, when things started to go wrong, when the world seemed to fall apart, and they didn't know how to stop it. The plane dropped again, more violently this time. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a hiss, and the chaos erupted. The passengers screamed, some of them fumbling to put on their masks, others crying out in fear. The young flight attendant was at the front of the plane now, shouting orders that no one could hear over the rising panic, her voice barely rising above the noise. But there was something in the way she was speaking that didn't sit right with the elderly man. He had seen it before, seen people who couldn't handle the pressure, people who cracked when things got too real. But he had learned long ago how to stay calm, how to keep his cool when everyone else was losing theirs. He had been through too much to let fear take hold of him now, and as the plane pitched and rolled, he knew what needed to be done. The young attendant was now rushing down the aisles, trying to calm the passengers. But she was clearly in over her head. Her movements were erratic and uncertain. The elderly man stood slowly, his hands gripping the seat in front of him. As he rose to his feet, the flight attendants were too busy to notice him, now all of their attention focused on the chaos around them. But the man had seen it all before. He had dealt with crises far worse than this, and he knew exactly what to do. Without thinking, he stepped into the aisle and started moving toward the front of the plane, his steps steady and purposeful. He was already scanning the cabin, looking for the weaknesses, the things no one else had noticed, the things that would make the difference between a smooth landing and a disaster. He moved with the precision of someone who had lived through far too many life or death situations, his eyes flicking from the crew to the passengers, his mind already working out the logistics of the situation. He didn't waste time on pleasantries or false calm. He moved directly to the young flight attendant, who was still trying to make sense of the confusion, her face pale with fear, but when she saw him approach, something in her changed. A flicker of recognition, a flash of understanding crossed her face for a split second, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she simply stepped aside as the elderly man took control. He didn't need to speak to them, didn't need to give orders that would go unheard. Instead, he began organizing the passengers, moving them to the aisles with calm, deliberate gestures. He told the people closest to the exits to stay near them, and for the others to remain seated until further notice. His voice was calm and authoritative, and though no one knew it, they were listening to a man who had seen more than they could ever imagine, a man who had been trained to stay calm. When the world was falling apart around him, the young attendant stood to the side watching him, her mouth slightly open, her confusion growing. She didn't know who he was, but she could sense that something in him was different, something far more important than the roles they had assigned him on this flight. The elderly man continued to guide the passengers to safety, his mind already turning toward the next problem, the next step in the unfolding crisis that was now spiraling out of control. The young flight attendant was struggling now, her hands shaking as she moved between passengers. She tried to regain control, but the fear was obvious in her movements, her face pale, her voice cracking as she shouted instructions that no one seemed to hear. The elderly man could see it in her eyes, the panic, the confusion, the uncertainty. She was barely holding it together. The plane jolted again, another sharp dive this time, the cabin filled with a loud scream from one of the passengers. A woman clutching her child. The elderly man's heart tightened, but his focus never wavered. He stepped forward without hesitation, his voice calm yet firm. As he addressed the woman, he told her to sit down and strap, in that everything would be fine. It was a simple command, but it made all the difference. The woman paused her frantic movements, slowing as she obeyed. The elderly man moved down the aisle with purpose. He could feel the flight attendant's eyes on him, now watching his every step, still unsure what to make of this strange man who had just appeared out of nowhere and taken charge. But there was no time for explanations. The plane shuddered again, this time far more violently. It was as if the very plane itself was struggling against the forces pulling at it, and with each violent shake the panic spread further through the cabin. People were starting to lose it. They were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. This was no ordinary turbulence. The elderly man could hear the flight attendants now speaking into the intercom, trying to reassure the passengers. But their words lacked conviction. They could see it now too, the looming terror that everyone had been trying to ignore. They all knew they were in danger, but no one knew what to do. The elderly man moved faster now, his eyes flicking toward the cockpit. He knew he had to act quickly. If they were going to have any chance at all of getting out of this alive, he had to take control of the situation before it spiraled any further. He made his way toward the back of the plane, where the galley was. The flight attendants were huddled together, talking urgently. In low voices, one of them looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she stepped aside as the elderly man walked past her toward the rear of the plane. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the pressure building with each passing second. But there was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. He reached the small rear galley and began rummaging through the supplies, searching for something that might help in this situation. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he had to find it before it was too late. The young flight attendant was still watching him, her eyes full of questions, but also something else, something that bordered on awe. She had seen the way he moved with such confidence and authority, and for the first time since the chaos began, she realized that maybe, just maybe, he knew what he was doing. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. She simply stood there watching him as he worked, his hands moving with ease through the drawers and cabinets in the galley. The plane shook again, this time a loud bang coming from somewhere deep in the belly of the aircraft. The lights flickered, and the sound of rushing air filled the cabin. The elderly man froze for a moment, his mind racing. But there was no time to think. He had to act now, or they wouldn't make it through this. He grabbed what he needed, a small tool from one of the drawers, and turned back toward the main cabin, his steps measured, but hurried now, his mind already shifting gears as he prepared for what came next. He had been through so many dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a place where decisions were made with a gun in hand. But even so, his instincts were the same. And as he walked back down the aisle toward the front of the plane, he knew that the time for hesitation was over. It was time to take control and do what needed to be done. The elderly man moved through the aisle with a sense of purpose, his steps steady, his eyes focused ahead. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the tension thick in the air. The passengers were beginning to panic again. Some were crying, others were shouting, asking for help. But no one had the answers, no one except him. As he approached the front of the plane, the flight attendants were gathered near the galley, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The young attendant, who had ignored him earlier, was standing at the edge of the group, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes flicking nervously between the passengers and the chaos unfolding around them. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he had done, what he had been through. And they didn't have to. But they could see something in him now, something that told them he was different. He was not like the others. The man didn't stop. He kept walking, moving toward the cockpit, where the pilot and co-pilot were fighting to maintain control of the plane. The sound of the intercom crackled above them, but it was barely audible over the growing roar of the engines. The young flight attendant hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to follow him or stay behind. But the elderly man's calmness seemed to cut through the confusion and fear like a blade, and without another word she turned and followed him down the aisle. As he approached the cockpit door, he took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the edge of the handle. The door was locked, but he didn't hesitate for even a second. He knew exactly what to do. The young attendant watched him in disbelief, her mind racing, trying to catch up with the speed of his movements. But it was too late for her to ask questions now. She could only watch as the elderly man turned the handle with ease and pushed the door open a crack inside the cockpit. The pilot and co-pilot were both strapped into their seats, their faces a mask of concentration. As they struggled to keep the plane steady, the elderly man could see it. Now the signs of the damage, the instruments flashing warnings, the trembling hands on the controls. The turbulence was getting worse, and the plane was starting to lose altitude. It was clear to him that they were in serious trouble. They needed help, and fast. The elderly man stepped forward, calmly, his voice low and steady, as he addressed the pilot and co-pilot. The young attendant stood in the doorway, watching, unsure of what was happening. She was still trying to process everything, still caught in the confusion of the moment. The elderly man didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on the pilot's, the calm authority in his voice making them pause for a moment. As he asked if they needed help, the pilot looked at him with a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. He hadn't expected anyone to intervene. He hadn't expected anyone to be able to help. But the elderly man's presence was undeniable. The co-pilot turned to look at him too, their eyes narrowing with a blend of curiosity and suspicion. They had no idea who this man was or what he had been through, but something about his calmness told them that maybe, just maybe, he knew more than they did. The elderly man spoke again, this time his voice firmer, telling them they needed to land the plane now before it was too late. He didn't give them time to respond. He was already moving behind them, checking the controls. He didn't need to ask questions. He didn't need to explain himself. He just moved with the precision of someone who had been in situations like this before, someone who had been trained for moments like these. He adjusted the controls just slightly, his fingers moving quickly over the switches, his mind already calculating the best course of action. They needed to descend. They needed to get on the ground. And fast, the turbulence was still shaking the plane violently, but he knew that they could make it if they focused, if they worked together. The young attendant stepped into the cockpit now, standing behind him, unsure of what was happening, unsure of what to do. But she could see it in the way the elderly man moved, the calm confidence in his every step. And she knew then that he was the one they needed. He was the one who could save them all. The elderly man kept his hands steady as he adjusted the controls, his fingers flying across the panel without hesitation, his mind working at lightning speed. As he calculated the plane's descent, he could feel the fear in the air around him. But he pushed it aside. It was a luxury. He could no longer afford the turbulence, continue to rock the aircraft, the roar of the engines deafening. But the elderly man remained focused, his eyes scanning the cockpit as he continued making the necessary adjustments. The pilot and co-pilot were watching him now, their faces a mix of disbelief and awe. They had no idea who he was, no idea what kind of man was standing beside them. But they could feel the authority in his every movement. They could feel the calm in the chaos. And for the first time since the turbulence began, they started to believe they might actually survive. The plane shuddered again, this time harder than before, and the elderly man gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. The young flight attendant was still standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear, but her gaze never left him. She was watching him now, but he was the only thing that made sense in the madness of it all. The elderly man took a deep breath as the plane began to level out, the shaking slowly subsiding. But he knew they were far from out of danger. The damage to the plane was severe. They needed to land fast. They needed to find a runway before they ran out of time. He turned to the co-pilot, his voice low but firm, as he instructed him to call the tower, to let them know they were going down. They needed guidance. They needed a safe place to land. But as the co-pilot reached for the radio, something strange happened. A loud bang came from the rear of the plane, a jolt so sudden it made the whole cockpit shake. The elderly man's head snapped to the side, and for the briefest moment he saw the panic flash in the eyes of the flight attendants and passengers. Behind them it was clear they didn't know what was going on. All they knew was that the plane was falling apart, and no one had answers for them. The elderly man turned back to the controls, his mind racing, his hands moving faster. Now the co-pilot was trying to reach the tower, but the radio wasn't working. There was no signal. The elderly man cursed under his breath. He needed to make a decision, and fast. They were running out of time. The plane was still losing altitude, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The pilot turned to him, his voice shaky, now asking what they should do. The elderly man didn't hesitate. He knew what had to be done. He barked orders to the crew, his voice steady and commanding, telling them to prepare for an emergency landing. The young attendant stepped forward, her voice trembling, as she asked where they were going to land. But the elderly man didn't have an answer, not yet. He was already calculating the options in his head. There were no good choices, only the ones that would give them the best chance of survival. He could hear the panic rising in the cabin again, people shouting and crying. But he tuned it out. His focus was on the task at hand. He had to get them down safely. It didn't matter how it was done. They just had to make it out of this alive. He glanced out the window for a split second, catching a glimpse of the ground below. He could see the sprawling fields and patches of open land. But there was no clear runway, no indication of a safe place to land in sight. They were too far from any airport. They were too far from anything. He cursed under his breath again, his mind racing for a solution. And then it hit him, a small strip of land, barely visible through the fog, but just enough for a chance. He turned back to the pilot and co-pilot, telling them to aim for that spot, to line up with the strip of land as best as they could. The pilots exchanged a look of uncertainty, but the elderly man's authority was undeniable, and with no better options they nodded and began to maneuver the plane toward the narrow strip of land. The turbulence had eased, but the damage was still apparent. The elderly man held onto his seat as they descended faster, now his mind clear, even as the world around him seemed to fall apart. He had done this before. He had saved people before, and as the ground grew closer, he focused on the one thing that mattered, getting them down safely, even if it meant risking his own life to do it. The ground rushed up toward them faster than he had anticipated. The elderly man could feel a tension in the air. The pilots were working with all their might, trying to stabilize the descent. But it was a fight. The turbulence had subsided, But the damage to the plane was too severe. The elderly man gripped the armrest, his knuckles aching from the pressure, his eyes locked on the strip of land below. He could see the uneven patch of ground. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only chance. He could hear the passengers behind him. Now some of them were screaming, others were whispering prayers. The flight attendants were doing their best to calm them. But it was clear they were just as scared as the rest of the people on board. The elderly man felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the weight of the lives in his hands. But it wasn't fear that filled him now. It was focus, the feeling he had always carried. When everything else seemed to fall apart, his training, his experience kicked in. And he knew what he had to do. Without thinking, he leaned forward and grabbed the nearest flight attendant by the arm, his voice low, but commanding, telling her to brace herself, to hold on. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but she nodded and did as he instructed without hesitation. He turned his attention back to the cockpit. The plane was too low, too fast. The pilot looked over at him, fear evident in his eyes. But the elderly man wasn't bothered by it. He had faced worse than fear. And in this moment, fear was just another distraction. He had no time, for he reached over the co-pilot's shoulder and adjusted the controls. The plane lurched again. As the ground drew closer, the elderly man's grip tightened around the seat, his heart pounding. But his mind was as clear as ever. The strip of land was within reach now, the narrow field only seconds away. And they were coming in too fast. They were going to miss it, unless they made a sharp turn. The elderly man didn't wait for anyone to speak. He shouted orders at the pilots, his voice cutting through the panic and the noise as he told them to bank left to make the turn, or they'd missed the strip entirely. The pilots acted on instinct, their hands moving in unison. With the elderly man's commands, they banked hard. To the left, the plane tipping dangerously, but staying level. Just barely. The elderly man looked out the window again. He could see the strip now clearer than ever, but the margin for error was razor thin. The plane was coming in too steep. The elderly man gritted his teeth as he leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the seat, as he gave one final command to the pilots to cut the throttle, to slow the descent just enough to make the landing. They followed his instructions without question. And for a moment there was silence. All the chaos, the noise, the panic, the fear, it all seemed to fade into the background as the plane hovered just above the earth, the ground growing closer and closer. The elderly man could feel the plane's wheels hit the dirt, a harsh bump, and then another and another. But they were on the ground. Now they were down. The plane skidded across the rough earth, its momentum carrying it forward as the elderly man held his breath. The sounds of the screeching metal and grinding wheels filled the air. But it didn't matter. They were safe. They had made it. The plane finally came to a stop. The elderly man opened his eyes slowly, his heart still racing, but the adrenaline was beginning to fade. He could hear the sounds of relief from the passengers behind him, and the flight attendants were already moving quickly down the aisle, checking on everyone. But for the elderly man, it was all over. His mission had been accomplished. He didn't need any thanks. He didn't need anyone to recognize what he had done. He had done what he always did. When lives were at risk, he had saved them without a second thought. And as the plane finally came to a stop on the makeshift runway, he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the weight of the world lift from his shoulders.